where they are in the proceeding. Well, let me introduce myself. I think I have met many of you before, but I'm David Chapman. I teach music out at Rose-Hulman, and I am in the Humanities, Social Sciences, and the Arts department. And so I'm responsible for teaching music theory, music history, and music culture classes as part of the Rose-Hulman version of general education. While they're studying electrical engineering and civil engineering and that sorts of things, they take English writing, which they hate, and music classes, which they love. And so I'm really lucky to be in a place like that. I'm a musician originally, so I have a bachelor's degree in piano performance from Kennesaw State University near Atlanta. And so my primary engagement with music is as a musician. And I am passionate about the musician side of music, which is kind of an unusual side of music. Everyone has an adult level engagement with music. Everyone has spent a lifetime listening to music. But musicians are a peculiar lot. You could just put a period there. But you could say, because they have a kind of interaction with music that I think is, they are both at once aware of its majesties and power, and also maybe a little cynical about its majesties and power. And so that tends to be part of my first engagement with music, is both an awareness of how big the world of music is, and then sometimes an awareness of just how practical the world of music is. My expertise in music scholarship tends to be in the area of history and theory. And so the hazard of a job like that is that my theory and history brain is kind of always on. And so when I'm giving a lecture like this, where I'm thinking about how do I think about a concert, how do I approach a concert, it will be with that liability in mind. I'm always kind of thinking about how music is put together, how music is placed within histories, how we ourselves are participating in historical processes, even as we listen to music. And so that's what I'm going to share with you today. So I come at it from a professorly standpoint. Now, but I'm a particular kind of professor, because, and it's not a very prestigious job in the big world of music, but my main job is to explain music to non-musicians. Because I'm a music professor at Rose-Hulman, none of my students are music majors. Many of them are very experienced or very educated in music, but I don't have colleagues and I don't have graduate students, and so my job is really to explain music to non-musicians. And that comes in clutch many times, and especially in an environment like this, where I get to talk to you about my love and knowledge of music, and I try to put it in language that people can understand. And so I think that tends to be an asset rather than a liability. I also happen to be the vice president of the board of directors for the Symphony, and we could talk more about that and what that means to me if you would like during the Q&A afterward. But I really see my service to the Symphony and its board as part of my legacy that I want to leave and the investment I want to make in the town of Terre Haute. When I teach students at Rose, those students leave. They don't tend to stay in Terre Haute and then reinvest what I have invested in them. So working with the Symphony is my way of giving to Terre Haute, the city. And so I'm really proud to be the vice president of board of directors, and proud especially to be here talking to you today. So let's get started. This is a preview lecture for the Double Concertos concert that's coming up on March 16th, and I will just hope that all of you already have your tickets for this event, and if you don't, then you can go to thso.org and get your own tickets. We are going to hold this concert in Hatfield Hall over on the Rose-Hulman campus. I will say, and I suppose I'm biased in this regard, but I think Hatfield's one of the best halls in the city. Yes. And so if you haven't heard a concert in Hatfield Hall, you should treat yourself and come and see an event in Hatfield Hall. It's a really beautiful space. You know, the way that higher education works is some wealthy donor decided we needed a really beautiful hall, and we didn't even have programs to fill it yet when he did all of that donating. And so we have this gorgeous hall, and we're really proud of it and eager to share it with the community. this is the program that will be performed on the concert. And so what I want to do is to go relatively slowly through each of these pieces and tell you a little bit about how I think about these pieces as we move into the concert. I didn't know any of these pieces before I started to prepare for this event, and that's not unusual. I often have people come up to me at Rose-Hulman. I'm one professor at Rose-Hulman, and we've never found a human culture at any point anywhere in the world that didn't have something called music. And I am one professor of music. And so the likelihood that someone will come up to me and go, "Do you know blank?" And I'll say, "No." And they'll say, "How are you a music professor and you don't know blank?" And the truth is, there's more that I don't know. The joke I make to my kids sometimes is, you could fill a library with all that I don't know about music, and they have, and it's called a music library. I mean, there's so much out there that I don't know. And so it's been a real pleasure to dive into these pieces in some depth in the last couple of days. So it's a concert that takes as its theme concertos, double concertos specifically. And so I want to start with this term concerto. And so the way that I always introduce the genre of concerto to my students is to talk about how it comes from the original Italian word, concitare, which means to plan, to arrange, and especially to contend. So you can imagine like the concerted effort of a lot of different people is an arrangement of a lot of people. It's a coordination among different forces. But what's really interesting is this idea of contention, that there is tension and contrast and conflict in the notion of concerto. When we have a music concert, you can kind of think of it as assembly, more so than we think of it as tension. But the concerto really embodies that sense of tension at the core of its form. So musically, as you see here, it's an exploration of contrasts. And there are a couple of ways you can think about that. The primary one is instrumentation. All of us may be familiar with the concerto as a soloist and an orchestra. And the contrast of the small ensemble or the individual soloist against the large orchestra. That's the chief contrast that characterizes the concerto. But there are other contrasts to be found. The concerto is a multi-movement form and has been at least since the Baroque era. And so each movement takes a slightly different tone and mood and tempo especially. And so you'll see under form here, fast, slow, fast. Generally speaking, in the Baroque, classical, romantic, and into the modern era, although the moderns, they did their own thing. So generally speaking, a three-movement work tended to have a fast, slow, fast arrangement. That doesn't mean that some don't defy this, it's just that's the genre expectation. You can have a fairy tale without a princess in it, but certainly everyone who writes a fairy tale knows that people will expect a princess. And so these expectations can be either, it can be a delight to see them confirmed, or they can be a delight to see them surprised. And so those genre conventions are nevertheless important, even when a composer decides not to follow them. The concerto began in the Renaissance as an antiphonal choir composition. So in Venice, there were these grand cathedrals with different naves off the central altar, and they would have one entire choir down this side and another entire choir over here, and they would perform at each other and at the audience. And hearing that kind of stereo antiphonal effect was the origin of a music genre known as a concerto. We would have these vocal concertos, these choir concertos. In the Baroque, things began to change where the concerto became less a vocal genre and more an instrumental one. And you would have various different instrumental sizes and contrasts. So it was not uncommon in the Baroque era for you to have an entire string quartet versus an entire string orchestra. Right? And so the scale of the small and the large, it could be all kinds of different mixes. You could have two soloists duetting each other against an orchestra, or you could have three against an orchestra. Today we might think of a double concerto as something kind of unusual and rare, but the truth is, in the Baroque, you had all kinds of different instrumental contrasts between the small and the large. And concertos tended to be dominated by the ritornello form. And we'll talk about the ritornello. You might see the English cognate, actually, at the root of that word. This idea of returning musical themes. That's going to play a huge role in the ritornello form. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. The Bach that we're going to see is an example of a Baroque concerto. Then we get to Mozart's era and the classical era, and the concerto is still typically a three-movement work, fast, slow, fast, and instead of ritornello forms, we start to see sonata forms, and we'll talk a little bit about sonata form as well. And then in the classical era, it becomes more characteristic that you would have one soloist versus an orchestra. There are exceptions to that, of course, but our tendency to think of a concerto as one soloist versus an orchestra really comes out of some of the changes in the classical era. So, let's begin with Papa Bach. The concerto that Bach wrote for oboe and violin follows this fast, slow, fast, multi-movement expectation. And the first movement is made in this Baroque ritornello structure. We call it the idea because it's not really a form that I'm showing you here as much as it is a kind of concept that composers could twist and change and make their own in different ways. But you see that the ritornello form is this kind of string of pearls where you have these alternating sections where this musical section that is known as the ritornello, the return, is always going to be the same melody. So one of the things I'll do in a minute is we'll introduce you to the ritornello theme of the first movement of Bach's concerto so that when you go to the concert, you'll say, there it is. And then there'll be this departure, and the composer does all kinds of interesting creative things, and then the ritornello comes back because, after all, it is a returning theme. And then something else creative and interesting happens, some kind of dalliance or far out point, and then the ritornello returns. And so understanding that ritornello as the backbone of the form is key to understanding the Baroque ritornello. And there are some other features here. Often the ritornello is what we understand to be the full orchestra, right? In Italian, tutti, everyone. And then the episodes are our small group, so either our soloist or our soli group, meaning literally multiple soloists. And so this contrast that we talked about at the core of the concerto is often overlaid on this ritornello form in some way. And of course, it's almost never this simple. Because of course the composer can follow this and then depart from it in any way they want to. And often they want to. They might follow this for some parts of the form and then find some way to weave together the soloists and the full orchestra in some delightfully creative and surprising way. And so finding the form confirmed is a delight. Finding the form resisted is a delight. The surprise and the confirmation of our expectations are both parts of the pleasure of listening. Now, if we take one of these little ritornellos here, I want to dive in and talk a little bit about the form. This is more interesting than it seems. To flay the frog is you can learn something from that, although it doesn't always tell you like how a frog lives in the wild, right? There's things to learn from taking the thing apart and labeling its parts. So most of us are probably familiar with the theme type that's called the period. So if you don't know, I'm going to do a thing that every once in a while David Bowden will sing a melody from stage, and we sometimes get comments, David shouldn't sing. It's an opportunity for the musicians to play. I'm going to sing. I feel like at least it'll help to kind of bring some melodies up to your mind. But the period is a theme type that you are familiar with from Fur-Elise. Okay, so Fur-Elise, da 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 ba da da dee ba da da dum. That's the first phrase, the antecedent, and then what happens? Da 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 dum, ba da da dum, ba da da dum. Right? It repeats the same internal phrase. So what we heard was the antecedent was the first part, and the consequent. The first time we hear it, it ends with this inconclusive punctuation, musical punctuation, almost like a question, right? So just like if I were to ask you, did you pick up crackers at the store? Question mark. And then the answer to that is, yes, I picked up crackers at the store. And then you hear the tone of my answer dropping down, right? So tonally, we can have these kind of like questions and then answers. And so music does the same thing. So just like I just sang to you, I'm going to sing to you again. That's not conclusive yet. It's kind of left open with an unresolved question. And where's the answer? There's the answer. Now we're finished. So this idea of the half cadence, the open punctuation followed by a closed punctuation, that characterizes the period. Now, I went and spent all that time explaining the period, and that's not what we have in the ritornello. Okay? So I just wanted to make sure that you understood that you can take these melodies and kind of crack them open for their structure. This is the structure that we will associate with the ritornello theme at the beginning of Bach's concerto. It's called a sentence. And in all my years of studying piano before, really before grad school, I had never heard of a musical form called a sentence. This is something I learned in grad school, and it's remarkably useful. And instead of having two paired phrases with a kind of question and answer, it is a form, a melody form that is characterized by repetition and acceleration. So you have this idea here, which we call the basic idea. It's some two-bar melodic fragment that's then repeated in some way, and then you get a one-bar idea that's much shorter, and then another one-bar idea. You notice that we get 2, 2, 1, 1, shorter cadence. There's an acceleration throughout the entire structure, and there's a lot of repetition of simple musical ideas. One of the most famous sentences is Happy Birthday. So, happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday, happy birthday, happy birthday to you. Do you feel that? Right? You see how there's this acceleration in the melody? That is a sentence. So that's the form of Bach's ritornello theme. And I just want, we're going to listen to this in just a second. I want to highlight a couple of musical features. One is that the oboe has this very, it's not intended to be silly. You know, Haydn, if you've ever studied or listened to Haydn symphonies, Haydn loves a good joke. In fact, there's a whole symphony where he has the oboe do a little cuckoo sound in the background. And I don't think Bach was doing that, but if you listen, you can hear the cuckoo, and it's really useful to clue in on the cuckoo part, because it becomes part of the way that Bach builds some of his episodes between the ritornelli. So we'll listen for the basic idea, and then the way that the oboe kind of cuckoos at the end of that basic idea. It happens again, and then there's this descending scale pattern, and then a cadence. So let's listen to that, and let's see if you can hear the cuckoo at the end of the basic idea, and then the descending lines of the fragmentation. So, by the way, this link to this web page here, I will make sure that Melissa and Pete send to you all if you'd like to listen to some of these pieces on your own before the concert. So, here's the opening ritornello. Basic idea. Did you hear the cuckoo? Basic idea too. You hear the cuckoo? Descending scales. Cadence. We'll stop there. Okay, that's the ritornello. I'm going to play it again, actually. That's the entire ritornello. One of the things that composers often do with a form is they repeat that main melody. And anytime a composer puts a repeat sign in it, they really want you to pay attention to it. So we're going to play it one more time so you've got that in your ear. Here it is again. The end of the ritornello. Okay? So, this is how Bach's ritornello is expressed over the course of the movement. And what you'll notice is I've kind of staged individual expressions of the ritornello, and the height here corresponds to different keys that he deploys that ritornello in. You'll notice the first one we just heard is in C minor, and the next time it comes in, it's in E flat major. So exploring not only the contrasts of tempos and instrumental forces, but even the contrast of what we call modes, right? Minor and major. And then he steps up again, and we hear the ritornello in G minor, and the way that we know we're nearing the end is we return home to our home key at the very end. The very characteristic tonal trajectory. We establish our home key, depart from it, and then return. Now, let's listen to a couple of those other ritornello. By the way, I'm not going into this detail on every single movement and piece, but it is fun to go into detail sometimes, and so that's why I'm doing it. Here's the second ritornello in E flat major. And then I think actually we only get half of the ritornello at that time. Then we hear it in G minor. No cuckoo, because the oboe is actually playing the main melody. Descending scales. By the way, all kinds of cool stuff is happening in the episode, but I'm going to leave that for the concert. You have to come to the concert to hear all the cool creative stuff in between. One of the things that Bach does is he takes that descending scale little fragment and he blows that out into its own episode. The cuckoo has its own episode or two, and so you recognize a similarity between the episodes and the ritornelli, but it's the jewel is being turned so that you see different facets throughout the movement. So some of you may have some musical experience, and one thing, I don't know if any of you have perfect pitch? Oh, good. Okay, so first of all, if you did, I would say, how dare you? Because I don't have it. But does anyone have musical training where you might notice a significance to C, E flat, and G? Anybody know what the significance of those three tones are? Well, then I'll tell you. On a keyboard, C, E flat, and G is the C minor triad. When you go and play C, E flat, G on a keyboard, it is the home chord in C minor. And so what Bach has done is, in the form of the entire movement, in the keys he has outlined the chord C minor, even as he explores the key C minor. That's the kind of stuff, that's the kind of terrible nerdy stuff that theorists and scholars love. That like, not only is he in the key, he's outlining the chord of it too. I'll just, I have this little audio here that you can hear. That's a C minor triad. Those are our keys throughout the entire measure. So Bach, the sort of consummate craftsman in music, has all kinds of internal resonances and sympathies built into all of his music. Well, let's move on to the slow movement. The slow movement is this opera-like love duet between the two soloists. The oboe and the violin sing this glorious operatic duet to each other, like we might see in one of these famed Baroque era love stories told on the theatrical stage. Now, Bach never himself wrote an opera. And we tend to hear Bach today as a kind of devout and pious figure. But his instrumental music, like this double concerto, is some of his least devout and pious music. This is music for an ensemble that he was director of in Leipzig called his Collegium Musicum, which was a group of young musicians, super talented. They had a regular concert series at Zimmermann's Coffee House right there in Leipzig. And so Bach wrote a ton of this chamber instrumental music, not to be performed in church, where a lot of his music was performed, but to be performed for coffee patrons in downtown Leipzig. So I think when we listen to this, we might be tempted to hear, wedding music in it, or church music in it, but I don't hear that. This is love music. This is an expression of earthly love rather than heavenly love. So I'll play just a little bit of it. And when I was listening to this week, there's a little movie connection that I thought of that I want to share with you. But I'll have you listen to just a bit of this. This is the opening theme from the Adagio. Gorgeous. You can see how the melodies just kind of flow out in this constant wisp or filigree of melody, and as they're kind of dancing and singing to each other. Did anybody think of a movie connection when you heard this? I'll tell you the one I thought of. There's a movie from 1986 called The Mission, where a Jesuit priest in the 1750s feels called by God to go and witness the gospel to the Guarani people in South America. And he brings, of all things, this is some movie fiction, an oboe into the middle of the jungle. And he begins to play this melody. And here's an orchestral performance of it. It's a very 80s-licious music soundtrack, but it's set in the 1750s, which is only about a decade and a half or so after Bach was writing his concerto for oboe and violin. Just one more time, just listen to the beginning of this little oboe part here. This is the movie from 1986. Stop it there, and this is the beginning of the Adagio. Do you hear the resonances between those two melodies? I don't know that Morricone was imitating Bach's oboe and violin concerto, but when I heard it, I thought, oh, this. It reminded me so much of the movie from the 1980s. But in any case, Bach was very much, in my opinion, writing a love duet, but I don't know that sacredness is ever really far from his music. In his cantata Wachet auf, for example, he stages this operatic love duet in the middle of a cantata where the bass baritone is Jesus and the soprano singing this heart-palpitating love song is the soul of the Christian. And so even for a good Lutheran, even an earthly love duet in an opera can have these theological significances. And so maybe holding both the earthly and the celestial at once is very much a kind of Bach value and something that we will return to at the end. Now, if the question of secular and sacred is maybe a bit more open in the middle movement, it is completely clear in the last one, it is secular. Because one of the things you can't do, even in a Lutheran church, is dance. And the final movement of the concerto is very much it, or at least you can't dance in a Lutheran church back in Bach's day. And I'm not sure about Lutherans today, but in any case, the final movement is very much a kind of toe-tapping dance in the style of his instrumental suites. We'll just play just a little bit of this. There's an energy. So I hear in that the musical features of the Allemande, the German-based dance form. So in any case, the concerto, I think, is very much of its time as a Baroque concerto and well situated in those coffee house performances. As much as we might hear today the music of Bach in weddings and in contexts that he couldn't have even fully imagined himself, I think of these as very much a kind of appeal to the body, both in romantic ways and also in dancing in the very final movement. Well, let's move on to Mozart, or we will never get through. So Mozart. Oh no, this isn't Mozart. I should tell you about the musicians who will perform these pieces. This is Erina Buckles. She has been our concert master for the past few years. Just a terrifically talented violinist. I have been listening to her for about 4 or 5 years. She came out and performed as part of a string quartet that she was in, based at IU. She performed for us out at Rose Holman, and I was super impressed 5 years ago with how talented she was. And then 2 years ago, she became our concert master. And if you came to the last presentation I gave here, where I was kind of emphasizing the individual soloists of the orchestra, if you went to the concert afterward, she performed just a blistering kind of gypsy solo on the violin that was stunning, absolutely fantastic. And frankly, we are liable to lose her very soon because she is working on a performance diploma at IU and will graduate and will be looking for the biggest markets she can get a job in. And so if you want to hear this remarkable musician perform, you've got to come and take advantage of opportunities like the event on March 16th. And so she'll be playing the violin part, and then Rebecca McGuire will be playing the oboe part. She's an oboe professor at ISU. And frankly, she is part of what I think of as really the highlight of the orchestra, which is the woodwind section. We have great sections. I love all the sections of the orchestra equally, but especially equally, I love the woodwind section. The woodwind section is they don't miss much. They are really, really phenomenal. And not to take anything away from any of the other musicians, but the clarinet, flute, oboe, bassoons, all of the woodwind section they're snipers. They just don't miss. It's pretty incredible. So you won't want to miss Rebecca and Aaron are playing this. All right, now Mozart. So similar to Bach, he comes from a musical family. He may be the most famous member of the musical family, but part of his tremendous talent and achievement is that he had a tremendous head start. He was learning music since he was a baby. And I wrote here on the slide a famously unemployed, maybe unemployable composer who's kind of famously cantankerous and a little bit difficult to keep employed. And the story of his unemployment is actually part of the story of his concerto for harp and for flute. It was written in 1778 for a very low-level duke in Paris, the Duke of Guienne. And the Duke of Guienne played flute, and his daughter played harp. And Mozart was hired during a very brief time he was in Paris that year to teach the daughter composition. And he found that task very frustrating. There's stories about Mozart sitting down with the daughter of the Duke of Guienne, and Mozart says, we'll write a little melody that does such and such. And she would just stare at him because she just couldn't, the inspirational angel just never visited her. And I have to say, as a teacher of college students, where you ask them to do a thing and they wait for the muses to stir them, that's just not how professionals work. And so I understand the difficulty and frustration that Mozart must have felt. I identify with Mozart is what I'm trying to tell you. That sometimes you're trying to get students to do a thing and they're waiting for inspiration and you just want them to do it. And so apparently that's the experience Mozart was having. But he wanted long-term employment by this Duke, and so he wrote a concerto for them to play together, the Duke and his daughter. And it didn't impress the Duke much. He ultimately didn't even pay for the concerto that Mozart had written. And he didn't hire Mozart long-term, and only paid half the fee that they agreed to for the composition lessons. And so it was not a very good deal for Mozart. But out of that unhappy business relationship, we get this remarkable double concerto for harp and for flute. Quite a weird concerto, actually, for Mozart, because he despised both the harp and the flute. The harp and flute were both instruments that were relatively early in their development at the time. Flutes didn't have quite all of the machinery that they ended up acquiring over the next century. Same thing with harps. They were both much smaller and much more limited instruments than they are now, which will surprise you when you see this piece being played, because you don't watch this piece being played and think, oh yeah, Mozart didn't have the full range of instruments. It is a very difficult piece for both flute and for harp. But Mozart was bored with both of them, even though they were very popular instruments in Paris at the time. Just anecdotally, Mozart had a funny thing he wrote in 1778, the same year as his concerto. He wrote to his father, who was also a composer, and he says about having to write for the flute. He says, you know, I'm quite powerless whenever I'm obliged to write for an instrument which I cannot bear. So even for dear old Mozart, dear young Mozart at the time, sometimes the muse was a little bit reticent to visit when he didn't like the instrument. Well, ironic too, because he has an opera with the word flute in its name, the Magic Flute, that he really didn't like much that instrument as much as some others. His concerto is also fast, slow, fast, just like the Baroque concerto. And instead of the ritornello form, the first movement is in the sonata form. So I've actually stolen a couple of slides from the last time I presented here about the form of sonata. And I won't go into too much detail. I mean, it will look like a lot of detail, but boy, we could go even further than what I'm going to do here. The basis for the sonata form is in what we call the ternary idea. This idea of the three-section structure, where when you hear the word ternary and three or tripartite, you might think A, B, C. But ternary form does something different. It goes A, B, A. The third section is a repeat of the exposition. So the ternary idea is about presenting musical material, departing in some way, much like the episodes of the ritornello, and then bringing back the initial music. So those of you with a little musical training, do you know what these symbols are here? Repeat signs, right? So these are repeat signs. When I'm talking to computer engineers at Rose-Hulman, I say, this is a looping function when you're programming, right? So you play through A, and when you hit the backward-facing dots, you go back to the forward-facing dots. So you play that twice, and then you proceed into the B section. You play B and A together, and then the looping function takes you back to the beginning of B. You play the whole second section again. That's kind of the very basic idea of the ternary form. Ternary form pieces tend to be rather short. The classical sonata form explodes the ternary form out quite a bit more. Not only do you have a simple musical presentation in A, you actually have two different melodies in two different keys. And so over the course of A, you enact this departure from your home key, and you get this melody in some other key, the wrong key, we'll say. And then there's this far out point that development takes us into, lots of interesting creativities, surprises, new ways of hearing our melody 1 and 2. And then ultimately the goal is to get back to this repetition of melody 1 and 2. Do you notice what's different about the recap to the exposition? They're both played in the same key, right? They were originally, what was an escalator between the two of them is now a moving sidewalk between them, right? In between the two melodies, we stay in the key rather than departing the key. Now the concerto develops this sonata form even more. Instead of the repetition that we see here in this looping function repeat sign, it's actually composed out. You get one exposition, and it's tutti. It's the orchestra playing these two melodies. And then in the classical concerto form, we get two expressions, or we get an expression of the two melodies by the soloist. And so we hear kind of two sides of these two melodies. Sometimes this melody too is in a new key, and sometimes it's in the home key. It doesn't really matter. The important thing is that at the end of the opening A section, we need to have departed the key so that when we get to our recap, we arrive back both at the key and the melodies that we started with. Okay? The other big important thing is that at the end of the recapitulation, we have this special moment known as the cadenza. And the cadenza is a moment where the orchestra, the conductor, kind of plays a fermata, right? Fermata means to hold longer, to abandon the meter. And in that long hold, the orchestra cuts off, and the soloists go to town. And originally, the composer just left a big rest, and it was understood that the musicians would improvise some kind of fireworks off their instrument to fill that cadenza. Later on, cadenzas began to be composed out by composers. Mozart's double concerto for flute and harp that we'll see, Mozart didn't write a cadenza, and many other composers have written cadenzas to play. And I don't know which cadenza our two musicians will play. It was originally supposed to be improvisational, but how can you improvise with two musicians, especially when they're classically trained? That's a really tricky proposition. So generally speaking, soloists tend to play pre-composed cadenzas. So let me play a little bit of this. By the way, there's a bit of an acceleration throughout this talk. I am going to move quicker and quicker as we go through. So if you're looking at your watch, I promise I will have you out in time. But yeah, I think some of this is really interesting and really useful for preparing for the concert. So let's listen to that first melody of the tutti exposition, the exposition by the whole orchestra. This is the main melody. Arguably, we've left the main melody behind, or in a transitional moment at that point. But in any case, that's the main melody. Here is the main melody when the soloists get a hold of it. You recognize it? Yeah. And now we're in transition space. Okay, beautiful. My gosh, it's such a beautiful piece. Here's the second theme as the tutti orchestra plays it. Okay, and then the solo version of that is. Same melody, now being expressed at the smaller instrumental forces. And again, that's key to the concerto idea, is that change. Then we get the recap, which if we go back to our form, this recapitulation is what we call that second A. And so I want us to hear the lead into the cadenza, so you can get a sense for what's going to happen there. Hold. You feel how the tempo is gone? Now we're kind of wandering. So I don't know in the concert if this is the cadenza you'll hear. There are several composers. Andre Previn wrote a cadenza for this concerto. A couple of other composers. In any case, hopefully this kind of grounds you in the form so that you know what you're listening for, especially when that cadenza moment happens and everything just freezes. To know what's going on there is really useful. It's a moment for the soloist to really show off. Okay, so that's the first movement. The second movement is the slow movement. And again, like the second movement of Bach's, it is a gorgeous, a highly melodic, beautiful operatic. Unlike Bach, Mozart was very used to writing for opera. And so it's a very operatic duet, love duet between these two instruments. And I'll play just a little bit of it for you, and then I have another movie connection that I want to share with you. So here's the beginning of the movement. For sappy melody. I just love a good love duet. It's my favorite. So the movie connection is that, do any of you know the movie from 1980, Amadeus? This is the movie about Mozart's, I have to tell you as a historian, big problems with that movie personally. But there is this one moment where the alleged rival, Salieri, first discovers Mozart's music because Mozart's wife has brought a bunch of original pieces to Salieri to sell. And Salieri is gobsmacked that she's brought originals to him, because what originals mean is that it's just all in his head. He can write it out. He doesn't have to copy them because he's not worried about losing them, right? They're just always there, and he's stunned by the genius of this composer. And the first music you hear as he's realizing this is this second movement of the flute and harp concerto.
These are originals?
Mm-hmm.
So we're imagining, by the way, he's reading the score and hearing the music, because he turns the page in a minute, and then we hear the full orchestra of one of his symphonies. And so, but again, this is the music that the filmmakers chose to try to capture that moment when a composer recognizes the genius of Mozart. Very quickly, I'll just say that the third movement here is in what's called a rondo form. And a rondo is the classical version of the ritornello. The ritornello, what was the main idea behind the ritornello form? The return, the repeated main melody, and that's the main idea of a rondo as well. There's this primary form, oops, that's not Mozart either. There's this primary form where you have a melody presented at the beginning, and it comes back multiple times. And now that I've gone for almost an hour, I'm reluctant to have us listen to all of these ritornello sections, but I will have them on this online document, so that if you would like to study this on your own, you can look it up later. That's the roughly the first half of the program. I don't know that it's the first half in time committed, but the first two pieces are now finished. Let me just emphasize these last two musicians here. We have a ton of Indiana University grads playing for us, and you'll get to hear the fruit of that tremendous musical program. But Melanie is our principal harpist, another extraordinary musician like Erina. You would have heard her at the September concert with a couple of solos. And some of you may also be familiar with her ensemble work. She plays in a duo for flute and harp with her sister, which I think they call the Angelus Duo, I believe.
Yes.
So if you've ever been to an Angelus Duo concert, or if you haven't, look out for them. It's Melanie and her sister who play in that group, and a tremendous musician. And then another really special person to the symphony, Angela Reynolds. Again, she's part of that killer woodwind section that I absolutely love in the symphony. Another IU grad, another ISU professor, and the artistic administrator for the symphony, newly appointed actually. As we are planning for our post-David Bowden, our next 100 years, having to face our next 100 years without David Bowden, we've had to find 3 or 4 or 5 people to replace him. And she is one of them. And she's come on board to try to help us manage some of the artists, the administrative side on the artistic side of the symphony. And so not only is she a tremendous musician and a pedagogue and with a pedigree of other symphonies that she plays for, she's also a really pivotal figure to the administration of the symphony now. And we're really grateful to her for that. Well, let's talk about these last 2 pieces, and we'll get through these rather quickly, even though they are heavy pieces. There's a real contrast in these last 2 pieces from the first 2. They aren't technically concertos. Barber is even less of a concerto than the Weir, though. The Weir is not a piece I was familiar with. I had never heard of the composer or the piece, and so I reached out to David Bowden this week to have him tell me about the piece. It turns out this is a composer that David himself knew, and he is a Hoosier. Here he is right here. Just passed away, actually, just a few years ago. And he was a longtime professor of music at Marshall University and spent many years in North Carolina. And I believe that's where David got to know him, because David is originally from North Carolina. He wrote this piece, Elegy, in memoriam Martin Luther King Jr. in 1997. And I'll just kind of briefly tell you about the form, and then I don't have a recording to play for you because this is a really quite rare piece. And so it's a treat that we will get to hear it at the concert next week. But as David explained it to me, it's a ternary form, which, how would you put that into letters? Do you remember the ternary form? ABA. This is my college professor thing coming out a little bit. Yeah, so ternary form is ABA, and the piece is structured kind of ABA, where each of those 2 sections, A and B, we might think of as like stages of grief. If you've ever heard of the 5 stages of grief concept. The A section is depression and sadness, and the B section is anger and activation over the loss of MLK right at the height of his effort to try to effect change in America. And then, of course, the sadness of the opening comes back in the second A. But then there's a coda. Coda is an Italian word that means tail. It's the thing that's always at the end of a form after the form is over. And the coda to this changes the tone a bit. And so maybe like another stage of grief where you kind of accept what's happened. There's a feeling of hope in the coda, and a resolve to take inspiration from the sacrifice of a figure like MLK. David sent me this 2 gigabyte file recording of the last time he performed it. So I've gotten to see and hear it. I'm not sure that I have permission to play it for you, but it is a real treat and a beautiful pairing with the Barber, which we'll talk about in a second. There was one more thing I was going to say about this. There's a really unusual pairing of the string orchestra on the one hand, and then an oboe and an English horn on the other. And the oboe and English horn are not contrasts to each other. They're almost the soprano and alto of the double reed choir. And so between the strings and the double reeds, there's a nice contrast of instrumental forces in this piece, which I think connects it well with the concerto, and then the elegiac grief-stricken tone of the piece really pairs well with the adagio. And it will feature Jennifer Kirby, our English hornist, another member of our wonderful woodwind section. Well, let me talk about Barber, and then we're going to stop, and I'll take any questions that you might have. As I mentioned, it's kind of a sympathetic pairing with the Weir. It's elegiac, it's relatively simple, it's kind of elemental in its scoring. When you look at it on the page, it's much simpler than it sounds when it's being performed. Structurally, it doesn't follow too many of the traditional forms, but it's more elemental in its form. It's arch-like. It starts low, gradually ascends into kind of a terrible climax, and then immediately begins to descend again, and that's the whole piece. It was first performed over the radio in 1938 to mixed reviews. People weren't sure exactly what to make of it. And since then, it has steadily accrued enduring status, most especially as the most profound musical expression of grief in the American musical repertoire. It was played over the radio in 1945 when it was announced that FDR had died. It was played at the funerals of JFK and Albert Einstein and Grace Kelly and the victims of the World Trade Center bombings in 1995 and at 9/11 and many more. You may also be familiar with it in the movie David Lynch's The Elephant Man from 1980 is the music that's playing as the main character is dying at the end of the movie. Or Oliver Stone's Platoon, very famous scene where a character dies at the end of the movie in slow motion to the sound of Barber's Adagio for strings. So, also in Seinfeld, because of this tradition of showing a death on screen to Adagio for strings, it's very easy to parody it. So Seinfeld and South Park and some other rude and disrespectful creators like that like to use it to try to call up that elegiac history to lend absurd weight to situations that don't deserve it. And so the irony and the parody of it speaks to its truth in a way. Now, I make a point to my students that meaning is not only determined by composers, but also by audiences. And an author's intent is not always the most authoritative. Barber did not mean for this to be an elegy. He did not write this in grief, either to express it or of his own, some feeling that he was having, or to create a piece that would be used to express grief. It's the middle movement of a 3-movement string quartet he wrote in 1936. And middle movements, as we know, if you have 3 movements, they are fast, slow, fast. It's the slow movement to a string quartet. And on either side are a couple of muscular, energetic, angular, fast movements that are every bit infused with the kind of energy of a 26-year-old really feeling his oats as a musician for the first time. And so it's really odd, in fact, that this adagio kind of it occurs in the middle of it if it's supposed to express tremendous grief. Some people have tried to see it as an expression of loss and sadness in the Depression, 1936, and maybe the rise of fascism. But of course, in 36, you can't know what's going to happen in the 40s. And so, maybe it becomes that, but it isn't that in 36. So here's a really odd thing. Barber wrote this piece, this movement, as he was meditating on a section of poetry by the Roman poet Virgil. And this is the section. So the Georgic poems come in multiple books, and they are an exploration of the kind of creaturely side of man. That there are impulses that drive us to anger, to hunger, to sexual passions. And in this passage, this is describing, it's about to be springtime, and even Disney's Bambi talks about how springtime is this swelling of urges that start with love and end with procreation, And so that's the urge that Barber found himself trying to express through this slow movement. And I'm going to read this poem. So what I want you to understand is that Virgil is trying to express this idea of the sap like rising in the spring, right? Or like the blood beginning to pump at that moment when creatures begin to turn their attention towards making new creatures, you know. So here's the way the poem goes. Just as when a wave starts to whiten in mid-ocean, it raises its breaker out of the furthest depths, and rolling along the shore, echoes, crashes savagely against the rocks, and falls like nothing less than a mountain. And the water boils from the deep in vortices and churns up black sand. Every species on earth, man and creature, and the species of the sea, and cattle and bright feathered birds rush about in fire and frenzy. Love's the same for all. Now, let's listen to some Barber Adagio and see if we hear the upswelling of spring urges, or do we hear elegiac mourning? Let's listen to a little bit of that original string quartet version. Stop it there. You can feel that kind of like slow moving ebb of a wave being born out in the ocean before it crashes and tumbles, but that idea of the lift of the sea and that slow movement. You can imagine that in a movement like this. And by the way, the adagio itself ends very inconclusively, which makes perfect sense as a second movement because he's about to tear your face off with the final movement, right? But as a standalone adagio, as a piece that is an expression of grief, that inconclusiveness of the end of the adagio has that feeling of a life cut off before it's fully lived, of expectation, of like schedules that for a week after a tragedy that aren't going to be fulfilled. And so who gets to say what this piece means? Well, Barber had his own thoughts, and we let him have them. But we have ours. And I think throughout the course of the 20th century, this became no longer Barber's piece. In fact, Barber himself, kind of like Tchaikovsky hated the Nutcracker, did you know that? He hated the Nutcracker. It plagued him through the rest of his life. Barber was so tired of this piece, he forbade it to be performed at his own funeral. Barber has his own thoughts, and we can have ours. And I think fundamentally, the Barber Adagio is this profound statement of something slow and deep and profound and beautiful, and maybe tragic too. We don't need Barber to approve of the meanings that we associate with the music. I'll just share with you one last film thing, because I'm always talking to engineers, I'm always trying to talk about films with them, just to give them something to connect to. But there's a children's movie from a couple of years ago called Inside Out. It's a Disney Pixar movie. And one of the central themes of the movie is that as this girl who is the main character begins to emerge into her teenage years, she starts out as a child with really simple emotional life. Her emotions, as represented by these glowing balls, have one color. And they may be sadness or happiness or whatever. And as she matures over the course of the movie, she begins to produce complex emotions. These beautiful objects that embody her emotion begin to glow in two colors, sadness and happiness together. And there's a kind of realization that in maturity, right, in adulthood, we begin to have these complex emotions, where the second movement of Bach's concerto can be both sacred and earthly, in a way. That the Barber can be both a rising of spring passions and also an expression of deep grief. And holding those two things together can make the experience of listening to music richer and have us always able to discover something more with pieces we've never heard before and with pieces that are as old as we are and maybe even older. And that's it for me. Thanks very much. Can I answer any questions? Can I offer my limited insight? I am one music professor, and I can only offer what I know. But, I'll pontificate as though I know.
I have no questions.
Okay.
Only observations.
Yeah.
The barber is, you don't realize how hard that is because it's slow, it's not technical, but the string players have to be really together during a slow piece. It doesn't get covered up by fast notes. The bowing has to be exact because they may have to change bow directions in the middle of long notes and you can't hear that. It has to sound the same all the way through it, so it's really really tricky.
Yeah.
And also string players don't breathe like wind players do, so that's kind of the function of the conductor in a piece like this is to help them phrase these things. They can't sneak in there, and especially a chamber group, you're so much more exposed, you can't hide in the group. So my other observation is that when Mozart wrote the Magic Flute, this flute player is an idiot.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I mean, and he makes Papageno have a hard life all through the opera with all sorts of terrible things that happened to him. So I think he got his revenge.
I think that's absolutely right. And the Magic Flute, the opera is barely about the flutist. The flutist is like the thing that holds it together, but it's about symbolism and Freemasonry and all other kind of other
motif.
Yeah, exactly. It is certainly a strong motif. Yeah, excellent observation. Yeah.
So as a musician, are you a singer, a piano player, an instrument player, a combination of all?
I am a piano player to a fault. I wish I had more instruments in my fingers, but I really am only a pianist. Yeah, so I trained classically as a piano soloist. And part of the reason I got involved with the Terre, Haute Symphony was that in college, the best gig I ever had was as the orchestral keyboardist for the Cobb Symphony Orchestra that was in residence at my college. And I just fell in love with orchestra music because as the pianist, I had the best seat in the house in an orchestra concert. I was sitting on stage by the timpani, hearing Pines of Rome and pictures at an exhibition. And so, yeah, so my training's in piano, and I was a composition minor too, so, yeah. I wish I had more instruments in me than piano. Pianists are a dime a dozen. Yeah.
We won't be hearing the first and third movements of Barber, is that correct?
That's right.
Just the adagio.
We're hearing the adagio as he recomposed it for string ensemble. So I don't believe we'll hear it as a string quartet, is that right? We're hearing it as the string ensemble version. He also arranged it as a choral piece with the words Agnus Dei from the Latin Mass. And of course, it's in all Latin Masses, but it's also especially important in the funeral Mass, the Requiem. And so, again, kind of calling up that elegiac tone that I think Barber ultimately embraced when he wrote that piece, that version of it. But no, it's just the adagio standing.
Are there any more Whitechapel series performances this year?
Yes, thank you for asking. So on March the 30th, we have an Argentinian tango group coming to perform for my Musics of the Global South class. And then on April the 27th, we have another event. These are both Sundays. April 27th, we have a cohort of students at Rose-Hulman, and a faculty member too, who are trained in traditional and modern Indian arts. And so we have a couple of dancers and a couple of percussionists, and I believe we even have a sitar player. And so we're going to do a student presentation of Indian arts, South Asian Indian arts. And so March 30th, Argentinian tango. April 27th will be students performing Indian arts.
Time is?
5 p.m. And announcements about that will go out in the local press next week. That's our goal, is to start promoting those. Yeah, thank you for asking that. Other questions?
Do people ever play the first and third of Barber?
Oh, sure.
Yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, string quartets, very frequently, I say very frequently.
Yeah.
It's in the rep, it's in the repertoire. I'm not well versed in the string quartet repertoire, but it's certainly not an unknown or highly obscure piece. The whole string quartet certainly fades in the shadow of its middle movement. But it is still played for sure. Yeah. And Barber's a 20th century composer. He could be pretty angular and dissonant, and he was also an opera composer too, and so he's also very tuneful and melodic and given to a delicious love duet now and then. So yeah. Other questions? Okay. Well, thank you for your patience. I appreciate it. Thank you.